that 14% of the projects were what they call a total failure, meaning they did not use them at all, 14%. So you can say, well, 14% is not that bad because that means 86% were successful. Not necessarily. From those 86% that were not a total failure, 49% were late from their original timeline, and 42% were over budget, and about 30 to 32% did not meet the business goals. So when you see those type of numbers, you can see that, wow, companies are investing a lot of money in IT and in projects, and they have to be very careful in how they expend their money. So you have to try to maximize the return of investment as much as you can.
Welcome to the Tech Show. My name is Aziza, and I'm here today with Focus GTS. Focus GTS is a niche IT staffing and recruiting firm focusing on 4 areas of technology, being business intelligence and analytics, data science, digital marketing technology, and cloud technology. We provide you with sought-out, in-demand talent, and we help you fill those hard-to-fill roles in IT. We're here today with Carlos Urrutia, a Chief Risk Officer previously at Swiss Re, and we're going to be talking about on how to minimize project failure and increase ROI. Hi, Carlos, and welcome to the Tech Show. We're so happy to have you today.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me.
For every guest that comes on our show, we have to absolutely know, are you Team Nike or Team Adidas?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Actually, I'm a Team ASICS.
Oh, that's interesting. ASICS. I don't think I've ever heard of that before.
Well, it's my preferred brand shoes for running shoes, actually.
Interesting. So since you're into running, is risk management a sprint or a marathon?
Risk management is certainly a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's something that you have to do it consistently from the beginning to end during the entire career and during the entire projects or whatever you're doing.
Yeah, definitely. So let's start off with talking about why is it important to manage project risks.
The Project Management Institute, a few years ago, they identified what a successful project is. And they said, for a successful project, it has to be on budget, it has to be on time. They said it has to meet all the functionality that it was designed for. It has to meet the business goals. And finally, it has to be used by the users. That's how they define a successful project. Then they did a survey, hundreds of projects in IT, and they found out that only 14% of the projects were what they call a total failure, meaning they did not use them at all, 14%. So you can say, well, 14% is not that bad because that means 86% were successful. Not necessarily. From those 86% that were not a total failure, 49% were late from their original timeline, and 42% were over budget, and about 30 to 32% did not meet the business goals. So when you see those type of numbers, you can see that, wow, companies are investing a lot of money in IT and in projects, and they have to be very careful in how they expend their money. So you have to try to maximize the return of investment as much as you can. And managing project risk, it will help you tremendously in minimizing those negative effects of any of those potential risks materializing and affecting the outcome of your project. So that's why it is extremely important.
That's interesting. So what you're saying is most of the projects that get started in IT actually don't make it through the threshold of actually doing what they had planned originally for it to be.
Most projects are not 100% successful. And that represents a waste of resources for the company, from personnel, from money, from investment.
Yeah.
So that's why it's critical. I remember a few years ago, I was called to be in the board of a project. This was a large integration project. It was multi-year, multi-million-dollar project. And the first thing I did was I said, well, can I see the latest status report? And they showed me this big report. It has a timeline. It has the original budget, the actuals, or how they were consuming that budget. They had a diagrams of the team, all the issues. It has everything. But I went through the project status report and I said, I couldn't find a section on risks, not even one page. So I called the project manager and I said, what are your project risks in your report? And the answer, I was like really surprised with his answer. His answer was, we don't have risks in this project. And I said, multi-year, multi-million dollar project, and we don't have risks? What about your schedule, your scope of the functionality in your project? You're managing vendors. What about they failing potentially? What about your development team? I mean, there are so many things that can
Yeah.
go wrong in a project that is imperative that you manage risk from the very beginning.
Yeah, definitely. So, as you coming in as a chief risk officer into an organization, what are the most important things would you look at, and what are the first steps would you take?
Okay, since of course chief risk officer is very, very wide. I mean, you look at all sorts of risks, but since we're talking about project risks specifically, and more specific IT project risks, what I would say is have a meeting with all your stakeholders. And I'm saying not only the development team, but involve your project sponsor, involve people from the business that might be impacted by this project, and certainly the project manager and the development team as well. And just do a brainstorm. Just think about all the potential risks that could affect the project. And remember, risks are things that have not happened, but that could impact your project. Some people confuse risks with issues that are already a problem. So identify those potential risks. And then what I would say, do something very simple. Just assign what is the probability that each of those risks will materialize or will happen. And then assign a scale of what will be the impact if that happens. And it could be as simple as low, medium, and high for impact and low, medium, and high for probability. Or you can go a little bit more sophisticated. But by doing that, what you can achieve is that then you will be able to identify those risks that are really more critical. Or if they would happen, they will have a bigger impact on your project. So let's say you can have in your brainstorm session, you can identify maybe 30 risks for your project, but maybe only 5 are in the category of high probability, high impact. So for those 5, design specific mitigation actions, write them down and agree with the team. What will we do to try to minimize the impact of those risks? It's not a difficult exercise. It's very simple. But then let's say every 2 weeks, or when you have your meetings with your project sponsor and your team, you review that list, review the probability and impact, review if there are any projects that are no longer relevant. Maybe they materialize already, or they are just not relevant and you can take them off the list. Or ask yourselves, do we have any new projects that we need to add? And that's a very simple way to manage your project risk. Document those things in your project status report, and it will make a big difference in the success of your projects.
And I see in the back, you have that picture there that says take risks. So yeah. I absolutely have to ask, since we are talking about risks, obviously a lot of companies bring in new projects, and of course everything has risks. But after analyzing and perhaps taking the strategy you have just talked about, it doesn't mean that they don't have to take the risk, right? So at what point do you decide whether you take that risk or completely eliminate the project or whatnot?
Exactly, and you said it right correctly. You don't have to, but when you are analyzing your top risks and you define your mitigation actions, you can agree with the team. It's like, you know what, we're not going to do anything. We know that risk exists. We're just going to monitor it. But maybe you can decide we're willing to take the risk. That's a decision, but it's a conscious decision. And you know that it could happen. You know what impacts it could carry. So at that point, you can decide we're not going to do anything, or we're going to have this plan B in case something happens, or we're going to be doing these other controls or these other precautions to minimize the risk. That's where you identify what you need to do.
Yeah, definitely. Where the country where I'm from, they have this saying, but it's just kind of among general population, not really to any company or project, but what they say is, that's in exact translation, they say that people who don't take risks don't drink the champagne. Would you agree with that?
Well, when I had this poster made, I also thought that there's a quote that says the biggest risk in life is not taking any risks. So sometimes risk management is not just trying to avoid all risks. No, sometimes from the risk management, you can say, you know what, you're not taking enough risk we might need to be a little bit more proactive in risk, but you have to find the right balance. I mean,
Right. Yeah, it's all about the balance. So, what would your advice be regarding that balance? Where do you stop? Where do you go? Where do you look and say, okay, this needs to have more risk or this needs to have less?
I
How?
would say, where do you define where you go and where you stop? It certainly depends totally on every risk and every project. There are such a wide variety of projects, in IT. I mean, you can have risks like, for example, risks from your vendors. If you're doing a project where you have external vendors, they might go out of business. They might not have the right resources. The resources could go someplace else. There are so many risks, from being late in your project, being over budget, not meeting the right expectations. Can I remember, just to give you an example, there are some projects that from the IT perspective, they are done beautifully. The architects and the software developers are great people and they do marvelous things. They can do almost anything in IT.
Mhm.
But I have seen projects that even though they have been completed in IT, they are not used by the users, or they're used maybe in 20% of the functionality. And that's because we fail in what is called adoption, and pretty much training the users and convincing them of what are the advantages of that new system is going to carry for themselves and in the way they do their job. But going back to your question, I mean, it varies. And I would say when you analyze your top risks and you decide what actions you need to take, that's the point where you're saying, okay, here we're going to do a little more, or here we're not going to do anything. Of course, you cannot just cover all the risks and put this amount of big controls, because that means your project cost is going to go up, because now you have more resources working on risks. So you have to find that balance, and it totally depends on your project and the team.
That's definitely a good point. I know that we work with a lot of the vendors that actually get like a new CMS in, right? Like something like Adobe Experience Manager, and they always say that their projects are almost 100% of the time take longer and cost more. And what they had failed to kind of get into is that talent, when they initially purchased the initial CMS, the talent is hard to find. There are not many individuals that are specialized in that specific technology, and it takes them longer to actually find somebody until they do. And from that perspective, what would your advice be for a company bringing on a new CMS and knowing that the talent is not out there, or maybe not knowing? How do you put yourself in a situation that you come out ahead instead of behind?
Well, I would say that you have to set the right expectations for your executives or for the board, whoever is your project sponsors. You have to set the right expectations. It is very common for developers, for project managers, and people that are in the projects to overpromise and then underdeliver. But what is happening? If you already analyze your risk and you realize that maybe for this specific technology or for this specific system, there are not too many qualified resources, there is already a risk that if that vendor loses some of their developers or experts or subject matter experts, then it's going to be a trouble. So if there is risk, then in your estimations for timeline of how long it's going to take, you need to add some contingency. The higher the risk, the higher the contingency. I have guided projects where I have 40% additional more time because of the amount of risk that we manage.
Mm-hmm.
It is different if it is if you're going to design a website and it's a template, you have done it many times and it's very simple, so your risk is small.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a new technology, there are not too many resources, you have several vendors, your risk increases. And that's why it's very common that they're usually late.
Mm-hmm.
I would say we have a lot more risk, and you can prove it. You have more risk, and that's why our contingency factor in our estimations is going to be higher. And that's why I'm estimating that the timeline is going to take a year and a half instead of a year, and you provide more realistic expectations so that executives can decide, do we want to do this project? Do we want to invest or not? That's the value that you can bring.
So I guess to just kind of finish this off, is at what point maybe they bring someone on board like you to, and then kind of go into like, if there is not someone like you on the team, how can they kind of evaluate it?
Yeah, I would say my advice would be for any organization, If it is a small or medium organization, usually they don't have chief risk officers, but that doesn't mean that a developer, a business analyst, a project manager, a business sponsor, a CIO, that they cannot manage risk. So my advice would be sure that in all your IT projects, it doesn't matter how big they are or complex, that you are proactively managing your risk. Obviously, a bigger project, more complex, you need more risk management than if it is something very small that won't have a lot of impact in your organization. So start by asking to manage the risk in all your projects. And just a clarification, some companies, what they do is they delegate that to the project manager, also manage the risk, but that's not right. The risk management needs to be done and is responsibility of everybody in the project team, from the project sponsor, the CIO, the director of IT, the project manager, the analyst, and the development team, and the business stakeholders. So all of them needs to participate in those brainstorming and in sessions of reviewing risk management. So that would be my advice. Involve everybody and implement, even if it is simple, a simple methodology to managing your risks in your project. And you will see that the possibilities for a successful project will dramatically increase.
That's a very good advice. Again, thank you for coming on to the Tech Show, and we appreciate having you, Carlos. I think you brought a lot of value to our listeners.
I expect that they will take that recommendations and that they will improve the outcome of their projects. So thank you very much for inviting me. It has been a pleasure.